Yeah, good afternoon. So the research I'm going to present to you today comprises of my PhD thesis, which I finished last year. And interestingly, when I presented this for the first time to my wife, who has a psychology background about 4 years ago, to sort of proofread, she said, "This is typical." What do you mean? She said, "Well, you have the freedom to research absolutely anything you want, and you decided to research yourself." So just to give you a little bit of context, what I'm going to do today is talk you through my journey into autoethnography, how I arrived studying from UC. And to start off, I need to give you a little bit of context. So the subjects of my research are white working class males. One of the key reasons is I work in education, and I have done my whole life. And started off with my experience working with young white working class men, and then sort of going out there and finding the trends about white working class males in English or British society. And so what we know when we look at the trends, if we consider class, gender, ethnicity, white working class males are the lowest attaining ethnic group within education, more likely to be excluded from education if we measure that based on free school meals, which I know is a tentative way to sort of measure this complex idea of class. White males from working class backgrounds are more likely to be below their peers in their core subject matters, less likely to go to university than groups from any other ethnic background, more likely to end up in similar occupations to their parents, so a sort of real lack of social mobility for that particular group. And then, of course, as I'm sure we've all sort of seen and come across in the past, the suicide rate for men works out about a man every 2 hours in the UK commits suicide. One of the key signifiers of the risk of suicide is white working class men or social class, but lower social class background. Yes, of course, thank you. So I won't do you the disservice of talking you all the way through the aims of my research. But essentially what I really wanted to do was to understand how white working class males are being encouraged to construct their identity. And what the media were by which these young men, myself included, were constructing their identity. What narratives are we receiving? And by we, I mean me and my participants, by way of what our social class is, our ethnicity, Britishness, masculinity. What are the narratives and how are these being received and indeed performed? Now, in order to do this, I needed to contextualize two things, two ideas that I wanted to look at. The first of which was social class. What is that? A very mercurial term. And the second of which was indeed this very thing I was interested in, identity. So what I'll do is I'll just briefly outline the context that I'm referring to here, because needless to say that social class is a complicated, multifaceted term, and there are different ways that this could be measured. In education, we tend to use free school meals. Apparently, class equals now low household income. But also we could use the NSSEC, rolls off the tongue, the Goldthorpe schema, Mike Savage's work on class. You can go out there and find a million different definitions for class. But what they all had in common was the work of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, who in his work Distinction talks about the idea of the intersecting factors of economic, social, and cultural capital. And so essentially what Bourdieu is arguing is that we consider class by those who are unable to generate an advantage when we're talking about working class, those who are unable to generate advantage based on either their economic capital, so their economic income, wealth, assets, cultural capital, education qualifications, hobbies and interests, and social capital, so not having the social contacts that will be able to garner an advantage in terms of social mobility. Once I was sort of set on how I was conceptualizing class, I then had to go out and do a similar thing for identity. Now, again, we will find multifaceted and complex, and depending on the discipline we're looking at, ideas about what constitute this thing that, or things, plural, that we might consider identity. But it was on the work of Erving Goffman where I settled. And Goffman's dramaturgical model, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but essentially what Goffman argues is that, to quote Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, and that effectively what we are doing when we consider this thing called identity is we are performing. I put on my, look, I'm a serious academic jacket this morning because I'm playing the role of a serious academic. I want to be taken seriously. And so we dress and we present ourselves in a way, but our identities are a constant stream of interactions. And they change and they shift when we are front stage, depending on the context, the audience. But likewise, when we settle down at home at night, when we're on our most authentic self, we are then reflecting onto our re-emergence onto the stage. Goffman called this impression management. Now, the reason I'm sort of contextualizing these two ideas is because it was a
coming across their work, in particular Bourdieu's theory of practice, that I came across this quote. And what I realized is halfway through my research, I was writing a biography. When I was thinking about white working class boys in education, what I was actually doing was writing about my experience growing up with long hair. I lived in a house with a lone parent mother and a sister. I like to play with makeup. I had long hair. And of course, that got socialized out of me very quickly once I went into education in all male settings. My father committed suicide when I was 16 years old, constantly searching for some kind of external validation, which he never seemingly found. Wasting my 20s with pursuing things that are ultimately quite destructive for me. Going into education later on, higher education at the age of 26. And one of the first social events I attended was what was nice, probably called Chav Night, where my middle-class peers went out and dressed up like me and my family, took the piss out of working class culture whilst on the booze. Shout out to the one young white woman who brought 2 black baby dolls with her. So some interesting institutional racism embedded within there as well. And the imposter syndrome that comes with this idea of being from a working class background and the chameleonization that is necessary in maneuvering academia as somebody from a working class background. Now, what I found in my research working with young men in secondary education and in college was that I ended up in this interesting space, which became known as the space in between. Because at one moment, it was insider research. These boys were speaking a language that was my language. They were speaking to frustrations in education that were my frustrations in an education system that was consistently telling them that the way that they dress, their aspirations, the way they talk was not good enough. At the same time, it was outside of research because some of these things that these boys were dealing with, social media in particular, was something that at their age I'd never had to encounter or necessarily consider and deal with. And so I ended up floating in this space. And the seminal moment in this for me really came when a supervisor asked, are you happy with the bifurcation of inside or outside of research? Or is there another space in which you sit? And that's where I found this space, the work of Dyer and Buckle, who talk about the space between. And so just in terms of the research itself, it was a 5-year piece of research using observations and semi-structured interviews with a group of cisgender white males that we could consider by Bourdieu's measure to be working class. There were 16 of these participants, and my own work, my thesis, was infused with vignettes talking about my own experiences and not only maneuvering secondary education, but of course, the world of academia, which I have since stepped into. And we used the process of constant comparison. And so as new ideas and themes were coming out of my own reflections on my own journey, plus the participants, I was returning to the literature. And through this process of constant comparison, I ended up with data saturation, findings, ideas, themes, narratives that were persistent and consistent across both the literature and what I was engaging with by way of conversations and observations. And so I used the work of Sharmaz, who I didn't take a grounded theory approach at all, but I used the analysis tools of grounded theory to put together initial coding and then put that into more focused coding. And so to sort of conclude on the research itself, I'm going to use this term we, and by we, I'm not universalizing my findings. What I'm saying is we, the participants, and myself. So what I found from my research was, first of all, that there are key agents of socialization informing white working class boys' perception of themselves. One of these is online media and what we might call the spornosexual masculinity. So a type of masculinity, a commodified, commercialized sense of masculinity that grows out of pornography and sport, in particular football. So when we look at the sort of the Joey Essexes of the world, we might say that's the sort of hegemonic masculinity, well-groomed, clean-shaven, six-pack, and the sort of problematic misogynistic elements that come with that type of masculinity. The boys were also heavily influenced by often absent fathers. 11 of the 16 participants didn't have a father living with them. I grew up without, my father didn't live with me. But the father's repudiation of education was a key factor in these boys' approaches and understanding. And then finally, these sort of all-male friendship groups that were significantly informing these boys' valuing of education or lack thereof. And I would refer you to the work of Paul Willis and his Learning to Labour study to sort of see how that is still very relevant sort of conversation that needs to be had. In terms of stigmatized identities, what I found was that we, the boys, myself, were alienated from academia. It was a space that we didn't feel we necessarily belonged. And they distanced themselves from this term of working class. And we could sort of talk about the success of the neoliberal post-Thatcher narrative here, the breakdown of community, how working class becomes about personal failure, poverty, because you didn't try hard enough. It's the meritocracy argument that these young men had embedded, a deification of the entrepreneur. Elon Musk can be worth 200 billion because he's a genius. I, on the other hand, failed in education because I'm stupid. So there was a conflation of the term working class with poverty and an apathy and failure. Working class was seen as a set of characteristics rather than a sort of social categorization. In terms of the performance of characteristics, so we, the boys, in particular in my study, saw whiteness as default. They didn't understand what I meant by what does whiteness mean to you. I realized I was white when I went on my first foreign visit at the age of 16 to Kenya, and I walked out of the airport and went, oh my God, I'm white, because I suddenly realized I wasn't what I was seeing around me. And so whiteness didn't mean anything to these young men, and so ethnicity was something that somebody else had. There was heteronormativity. So these boys saw their own position as default. So if you were not a straight white male, you were something different. You were odd. You were outside. And all of this is kept in check by banter. And banter is this sort of form of humor that is actually masking a very vicious, very tight-knit, hegemonic masculinity that is consistently need to be performed in order to belong to this thing that we might call white men. And finally, what I sort of concluded in my research was that the Thatcher project had been successful, that a lot of these young men deeply valued the idea of meritocracy, even though they themselves were not doing particularly well at school. And so what they were effectively arguing was that they had no responsibility to those outside of them. Whilst they were quite liberal with their views, if you want to, change your gender, go crazy. But at the same time, if that's what you choose to do, don't think I'm going to speak up for you, because that's not my problem. So there had been a breakdown of civic responsibility. These boys were employing the idea of meritocratic sort of societies, which is, if I fail, it's my fault. If I succeed, that's because I'm so brilliant. And a deification of the entrepreneur, and this valorization of starting from the bottom. So that was the findings that sort of came out of this. And as I say, what I realized at the end of this was my journey. This is where I'd come from. So hopefully some sort of interesting and relevant things there for you to reflect on. And thank you very much.
Wow, thank you very much, Dane. I think you managed to put a lot in those 8.5 minutes. Yeah. So I'm sure there's a lot we want to discuss afterwards, but for now, we will move on to our next presenter, Kari Silvola. Can a boy be raped? The evolution of autobiography to autofiction.
Thank you.
Yes, floor is yours.
All right, to see a full house today.
Yes.
A little trigger warning to begin with. So the text gets heavier in the end. So if you feel uncomfortable, don't hesitate to leave the room if it's too uncomfortable for you. It's the deal. I'm also totally hopeless with technique, even with my phone, so don't mind that. A Finnish author, Marta Tikkanen, wrote a novel, A Man Cannot Be Raped, in 1978, addressing sexual violence towards women. Past 20 years, I've been writing about sexual violence from the perspective of a child and a witness. While exploring the consequences of a rape on a boy 9 years of age, I also examine the metamorphosis of an autobiography to an autofiction. In this reading today, I will present 3 excerpts from a short story, from a monologue, and from a play. 2004. The summer cottage was ordinary, like thousands of other cottages all over Finland. The shady yard was left to decorate itself as well as it could. An empty swing swayed in the wind, the roses on its cushions withered. Here and there, haystacks grew among the tall spruces. The stairs, 6 or 7 steps leading to the front door, were slanted toward the woods, away from the sea. The front door led into a small, dim living room dominated by a group of rattan furniture. On the wall under a large window, a sofa with a table and 2 armchairs. A black and white television in the corner to the left. Next to the television, a step leading to the dining area, filled by a large oval dining table and chairs around it. In the back of the yard, a miniature guest shed called church. Just a playhouse, really. Room only for 2 narrow berths, a little nightstand and a narrow rag rack between them. 2014. I hear the sound like yesterday, the moan of an old rattan sofa. It hisses every time the heavy man stands up. He turns toward her, looks out of the window and says nothing. She's silent too. The sofa grunts when he sits back down. I sit in the dark and listen to the sofa gritting its long yellow teeth. The only glimmer of the light comes from the television, where the men die for the ball, score goals, jump into each other's arms. I hold a dark blue briefcase in my lap. It's brand new. Every time Mom comes home from there, she's a mist. A part of her is left to fade away somewhere behind a heavy gray door. Otherwise, I wouldn't have gotten such an expensive new school bag. Even the pencil case in it is new, and the pencils needle sharp, the crayons bright and shiny, the eraser unused. It's a weekend in mid-August 1974. School starts on Monday. I am entering the 3rd grade of primary school. The woman is beautiful. She is famous for it, known for her looks, her fashion, and her style. Her eyes are large and dark, her lashes long and luscious, at the same time revealing and concealing illness and heavy medication. The sofa sighs. Let's take another one, commands the godfather, sitting down next to her. When Mom grabs the glass, I get worried. She shouldn't be drinking. The room darkens, the shadows disappear. Her fragility, wrapped in a soft knit, can no longer be seen. The footballers continue their game. 2017. An actor stands alone in the spotlight on a dark stage. Actor. The Angora wool is wrapped so tightly around her delicate and frail body that it could almost break her in half. She is a beautiful woman. Even at summer camp, I was embarrassed on visiting day. The big boys went wild when they saw her. I hid behind a tree so they wouldn't find out she was my mother. Fat ass had a bottle on the floor next to the table leg. I don't want Mom to drink. The booze doesn't match with her medication. The spotlight goes out, leaving only the silhouette of the actor. I know that fat ass would come. Mom and I sleep in church. The once bright stripes of the rug feel soft under my bare feet. I lay down on my back and cross my hands over my chest. It's not long before I hear the floorboards grouse. A man and a woman in the middle of the dark stage. The man grabs the woman like a rag doll by her hair, pulls her out of bed and onto the floor, forces her to kneel in front of him. He grabs her head with both hands and makes a move like pushing his organs into her mouth. Her arms hang limp and unresisting at the sides of her body. Actor. He's so close to me that I could touch him. I could, but I won't. I just sink deeper and deeper into the corner. The man pushes the woman over the floor, spreads her legs wide apart. She doesn't resist. But when he touches her crotch, she suddenly begins to fight back. Actress, barely audible. What are you doing? Are you crazy? Stop. The man puts one hand over her mouth and tries to pull down her panties with other hand. She wriggles under him. The director, fucking good, keep that. The actor stands alone in the spotlight on the pitch black stage. The light comes straight from above and falls on him. Actor. The price of fame is high, and we must save our face at all costs. If I wasn't the one tempting you to this theater night after night, I'd go to some public toilet in a park when it gets dark, to the convenience where the guys go. Oh God, how I'd love to kneel. Director, stop, stop, stop. Kneeling should be heard in your voice. This is about reconciliation, reconciling shame, shame that cannot be atoned for. That's why you kneel again and again in front of the endless line of pricks. Take your mother's place. Your crime is that you didn't have courage, you didn't have the balls to defend your mother, to protect her. It's a shame you'll never escape. A woman's voice from the audience. What could possibly make you ashamed of? Director, me, nothing, I'm shameless, a top dog. The actor and actress are the only ones not laughing. Actor. The price of fame is high, and we must save our face at all costs. If I wasn't the one tempting you to this theater night after night, I'd go to some public toilet in a park when it gets dark, to the lavatory where the guys go. Oh God, how I'd love to kneel down in front of some stranger, nameless motherfucker, get down on my knees as if I'd never rise again, to look up some poultry prick and enjoy my last supper of spit, slime, and semen, to feast on the body of my master so that I could feel alive even for a fleeting moment. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Kari. I won't make any comments now. I think it's, wow. I think we'll just move on to the next presenter, which is Chris Saunders. There you are. And your presentation is entitled Classroom.
Yes.
Yes. So, and I will give you the microphone again.
Just put it on there.
Yeah. Not quite. Put it on the little sachet.
Good. Right. Difficult to follow. Right. Well, this is called Classroom, and it's about my, well, I'm just about to tell you, so I don't need to explain it. Yeah. So my dad, an East End working class self-made man, left us behind in the Essex suburbs of working class householders to begin a new life playing host to endless parties in his opulent London townhouse. Sorry. After years of his indifference, I was promoted to be his special guest, and I was dazzled by him. He had transformed overnight into a semi-precious man of wealth and taste. He was gentrified on the outside, done up to look grey and contemporary, but his emotional interior was gutted. I got a showy hello, goodbye hug, but I'm left with little except his lingering eau de cologne and his public limited company. I climbed the stairs up into the large Georgian reception room filled with the rich perfume, smoke, and the smug fug sound of self-congratulation. I can see their expensive shoes and legs through the balustrades. At the top of the stairs, I look around for my dad and spot him through the crowd talking with a man in a white suit, standing by the baby grand piano my dad had had with his girlfriend, who is now history, along with my parents' bitter mock Tudor divorce, which I'm still reeling from and cannot talk about here. Squeezing through the smart bodies to the sound system, I pretend to look through my dad's new record collection with soulless pop at one end and opera at the other, put together by an employee tasked with that detail. There are no references to the music we shared before he left us. A public school boy man in a tweed suit wants to know what I'm listening to. He sees me as an exotic 15-year-old other and wants to see if I'm as damaged and powerless as I look and he feels. He explains that he isn't at all creative, just a property lawyer, I'm afraid, he says. His D4 class envy is spooked tonight by the false impression that the frozen poles of class distinction might be melting in the hot air of entrepreneurialism. Can I borrow your jacket? This is such a connection. Right. I'm self-consciously aware of my lack of class and tone down my hard East of London accent to sound like I might come from somewhere leafy. I go red with shame when I realize I'm sounding like those squeaky voices of paper-based working class men who raise the pitch of their voices in order to come across as non-threatening and compliant to middle-class management. The same self-infantiling tactic is used by my classmate, Michael, who puts on a cute baby voice to win over the teachers so as not to sound aggressive or trouble. Despite getting 9 O-levels, he left school. He'd had enough of pretending to fit into an aggressively passive middle-class education system. I pretend to study the bookcase, which only has 2 books, The Little Prince and Who's Who. Where am I? I gulp champagne and watch a group of bored new money women flinging their long hair with a choreographed swish of the head to refresh their pose, standing in high heels, forced to spectate the business talk. The old women here do the same thing. The old money women here do the same thing, same hair swoosh thing, but with their eyes closed to show their pedigree. Gemma, a colonial swimwear model with regimental teeth that can smile underwater, is unimpressed by the salivating new money men who she insults within earshot, particularly the salivating. Oh, I've said that, yeah. Her ancient sheltering family tree gives her far back financial and social security. In contrast, the new money couples look like nervous, spindly saplings on the verge that need an ambitious man or woman as their wooden support. Larry, a city banker originally from New York, speaks with an even phonier accent than mine and has a floppy handshake and haircut. He soon looks past me, a teenager with nothing he needed to hear, and realizing the reason for being friendly has wandered off, he wandered off too. I notice Larry's wife, Pippa, is sunk in the same spot on the leather sofa at each party under a huge abstract painting that isn't speaking to me, but must have said something that appealed to Dad's interior decorator, who I'm guessing is as emotionally cut off as he is. Pippa looks as hunted as she is driven, becoming the arts editor of the Sunday Telegraph magazine, tasked with the unearned privilege of keeping culture where it belongs, distinctly unpopular. Her sharp eyes always on the lookout for the latest must-see shows that can suddenly appear out of nowhere like mice. She and Larry's marriage is an edgy truce. Larry is forever under pressure to excel in banking a fortune, while Pippa is under pressure to keep Larry fascinated with her class connections and promise of breeding a dynasty. Pippa knew Larry wanted her eggs, but she wasn't sure if she was going to let him have them. I noticed the low table with a vulgar display of casually scattered Royal Opera House programs in a tray. The red flags of my dad's new cultural capital has now been replaced by an enormous healing crystal, signifying his depth. And to go with this makeover are a new age crowd of solemn spiritual entrepreneurs that Pippa is now obliged to listen to. She looks like she wants to die and not reincarnate. Talking with Marcia, a jovial big drinker who likes to talk about being fucked, plays down her day job as a Mayfair art dealer. Marcia's oat smoke voice edges her stately conversational landscape towards some ornamental feature to show how puzzled she is by the striving lower classes with their suspect ambitions, sexual appetites, and eating out disorders. She needs a light and wonders if the stern bronze bust of my dad, smaller than his real life head, might be a table lighter, and pretends to look for the button. In my A-level Tudor history class, I'm told that there is a liberal tradition of individualized social mobility. The exceptional person proves the rule. But be warned, Henry VIII's right-hand men included Thomas Cromwell, son of a grocer, beheaded, and Thomas Wolsey, son of a butcher, also beheaded. I spot a haunted household name out of scale on the leather sofa who looks resentful for being a children's TV uncle and for being overlooked by Lord H, who doesn't recognize or care who he is and just asks him to pass the champagne. Lord H, who can open doors to the city's investment banks, is in partnership with the man in the white suit, over by the balustrade surrounded by his entourage that includes his lower middle-class wife, Jill. The man in the white suit's constant partying pushes Jill into a matey what-can-you-do relationship with this man she loves and sees his promiscuity as an inevitable part of going up in a meritocratic world. Unlike my mum's heavy martyrdom for my dad's infidelity, Jill wears her cross like a charm. Believing himself to be in a self-class made of his own, Dad distinguishes himself from the establishment classes he dubs chinless wonders, while the working classes on package holidays he likes to call peasants, a touchiness triggered by the shaming he experienced from his market porter father, who never thought much of his boy's pretensions to prefer opera to snooker. I inherited an inverse version of this father-son put-down by being shamed by Dad for being stuck at home in the suburbs, not aspirational enough, with my mother as if I had any choice. One hot evening, Dad had bussed in an extended East End family I'd never met before, who miraculously reappeared in his life, releasing crane drivers, firemen, florists, ex-prostitutes, market traders, dinner ladies, and others into his elite social circle in order to demonstrate his natural superiority above all classes. At the far end of the room, Dad had also installed his 80-year-old mother as the centerpiece where the baby grand piano used to be, where she sat at the table as a living East End relic, where she obliged me, billed, blimed, oh my God, all evening. At the end of these evenings, Dad gives out a Corleone hug with a discreetly loud call me into the guests' ears. I get something similar, usually with an earnest good to be with you, that always feels hollow as I haven't seen him all evening. Over time, the party guests disappeared once Dad could no longer afford to entertain them. He only ever had a temporary membership to the establishment class, and having traveled such a vast social distance to have a room at the top, his reason to stay there began to lose its meaning. He downsized and downsized and downsized and downsized until he couldn't be seen anymore. I used to bump into the inherited furniture of my own dark emotional interior until I let the light of understanding in. I learned at university that social mobility means nothing unless we all rise together. Who wouldn't want that? I mean, who wouldn't want that? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. It was good to laugh a little again. Yeah. That's a great thing about these conferences. You know, they bring out all kinds of feelings, emotions, reactions. Perfect. So we have our last presenter, Pete Saunders, in the memorations of a PhD candidate. So I will hand on this microphone.
Murmurations. Last year, I attended for the first time an autoethnographic conference. It was the 10th International Conference of Autoethnography here in Bristol. I had just started my own PhD journey, dedicating the first year to writing my research proposal. Somehow, I came into contact with autoethnography. I don't remember how, as I was not taking notes at that time. Autoethnography was a methodology, a mindset, a worldview new to me. Somehow, I came across this conference and decided to go. Going through the descriptions of the workshops, I felt it was difficult to choose. There were so many interesting topics. One presentation, however, directly stood out for me. Just reading the title was enough. Silence is Golden, by Anne-Marie Loftus. I immediately knew I was going to attend this workshop. I've been interested in the phenomenon of silence ever since I saw the 17th century painting, The Philosopher, by the Italian painter Salvatore Rosa in the National Gallery in London in 2002. In this painting, a philosopher holds a tablet with a Latin text. The text calls upon the reader to be silent or say something better than silence. There was a second reason I needed to attend this workshop, but that only became clear being in the workshop. Anne-Marie Loftus shared her beautiful, vulnerable, and moving story about her experiences associated with failing in academia. It was a brave story and aroused a lot of resonance in her room. I dared to ask a question and contributed to the important conversation about failing and succeeding in the PhD process. One of the participants suggested to not only talk about failing in academia, but also ask the question, do academia fail us as PhDs? This was all last summer. A couple of months later, on the evening of February 2nd, a storm of internal whispering was taking place in my mind, especially as I accidentally stumbled twice upon the word murmuration that evening, in a way that is in line with the concept of accidental autoethnography as described by one of the keynote speakers of this conference, Christopher Poulos. The first time was when I read the theme of this year's International Conference of Autoethnography, murmurations. I instantly thought about the soft, continuous sound of people talking quietly. My PhD project focuses on the inner murmurations of PhD students, inner voices that whisper, that draft is not good enough, privileged male, but also, oh, that feels like an exciting discovery. I started wondering, should I submit an abstract? But then again, I just started my research and did not feel I have much to contribute. There was a second moment that evening that I came across the term murmuration. I was watching a Netflix series, Maniac. At that moment, an inner silence descended upon me. The Japanese call such a moment ma, a living pause where meaning is created and perspective shifts. My inner dialogue quieted and the stillness created openness. I no longer doubted and decided to submit. This is not the end, but just the beginning of a story, an autoethnographic story. It's an unfolding story, and it's a story about silence and a bit about coincidence. Let me explain what my PhD is about. My project focuses on the dialogues, the inner dialogues within PhD students. An inner dialogue is an internal conversation among different viewpoints within a person. This conversation can take place silently or loud, or it can even be murmured. Inner dialogues are a central element in the theoretical lens that I'm taking and that I'm using, the dialogical self theory by Hubert Hermans. A key element of the dialogical self theory is the critical stance it takes on the concept of the self. Contrary to mainstream psychology, the dialogical self theory states that the self of an individual consists of multiple I positions that are in continuous dialogue with themselves and the world around them. In the self, these I positions have or develop their own voices that can interact with each other. Some voices can also internally be silenced. What I'm interested in is the inner dialogues of PhD students and what stories they tell themselves. On March 27th, I received a message that my abstract had been accepted. This felt as a glorious moment that is worth a sip of water. A milestone for me as a PhD student. A month later, I had a meeting with my two supervisors. I prepared a beautiful PowerPoint to update them. The acceptance of the abstract featured prominently. My supervisors congratulated me, but did not spend much time on the topic. I was slightly disappointed, to say the least. We spent most of the time discussing potential strategies for my PhD. One of my supervisors suggested to change the research subject from PhD students to leaders newly appointed to their next leadership position. This came as a shock. My different I positions had all fully committed themselves to contribute to the existing knowledge base on inner dialogues of PhD students, which is limited, and to develop a coaching program that helps to increase PhD students' resilience and mental well-being. That is very necessary because the mental health of many PhD students is poor. In a survey by the Promovendi Network Nederland, 60% of the PhD students indicated that their workload is high or too high, and around 40% showed symptoms of burnout. This is in line with the range of 40 to 50% of PhD students suffering from mental health problems reported by other studies, for example, Levesque in 2017 in Research Policy, and Evans and others in 2018 in Nature. This is 3 to 4 times the average of the whole population. Now that my 2 supervisors suggested to shift the focus, I felt anxiety creeping in. An inner dialogue unfolded. Should I go along with the suggestion of my supervisors? Or should I withstand and still follow my own desire? What would be the consequences if I did not go along? Did I not sufficiently underpin the theoretical motivation for selecting this group? Why did my supervisors say that the relevance and impact would be much stronger if I would focus on leaders? And if I would focus on leaders, could I still do autoethnography? From the academic literature, I know that it's important for PhD students to have an open attitude and a willingness to search for new ways of being. With my anxiety and knowledge about the importance of openness, I left the lunch meeting. We agreed that I would take time to let the suggestion sink in. Coincidentally, the next week I had planned a micro-research sabbatical, a week to focus on my PhD. During the first days, I went on walks in parks and forests. During these walks, enthusiasm started to grow to take a broader perspective. One of my eye positions, the creative one, whispered to me, well, maybe you can focus on inner dialogues during mid-career transformations. My opportunistic eye position became excited and saw opportunities. It screamed, yes! And then you can also better explain the link with the research program of one of the supervisors. This will increase your chances of getting a scholarship. My soul-related eye position murmured, are you sufficiently motivated to look into leaders? You're more interested in PhD students. And my logical eye position said, think deeply about the explanation for these 2 very different groups. In the end, we agreed in a democratic way that I would zoom in into 2 specific kinds of mid-career transformations. People appointed to their next leadership position and people that started their PhD mid-career, like me. To conclude, literally and figuratively distancing myself, tapping into my curiosity and going on walks in parks and forests allowed me to enter a moment of silence. A moment of silence where meaning was created, perspective shifted, and an inner dialogue unfolded that led to a more open attitude. I experienced another moment of Ma, the living pause, which allowed me to move forward. It is this actionable silence that I want to further explore and investigate, and I want to see if this silence that gives space to inner dialogues can help other PhD students as well. Thank you.